Okay. So I'll try briefly to present my work on the semantic features, so the title is a bit ambitious. So it says it mentions automatic analysis of verbs of creation, and basically in Bulgarian and English. But basically, the focus is on the semantic features which would allow to process towards semantic analysis of verbs and basically disambiguation of verbs of creation according to some semantic classifications that I will present now. So the aim is to first outline the scope of the semantic class of verbs of creation as a subclass of dynamic verbs. The objective is to present the description of creation verbs in terms of their corresponding semantic frames, and to outline the semantic features of the frame elements that compose the situation presented by the verb. And my observations are based on Bulgarian and English data, which are extracted from a few corpora, which I will mention in a moment, and to basically discuss the language-independent features that influence the type of realization of the verb, as well as some language-specific features in the semantic description. So as a point of departure, I use the Vendor's classification of activities, achievements, accomplishments, and states. And my focus is basically on the activities, focusing on the dynamic verbs and distinguishing between them, and basically then focusing on to activities and how they can be distinguished from achievements and accomplishments based on Vendor's classification. So some background, I've put some references there as well. So basically, in order to have an understanding about activities in relation to other spatial classes, we need some additional notions, and what I will present what authors basically focus on when they deal with the topic. One of the features is the feature of scalar or non-scalar change. So basically, verbs of creation, they are in essence verbs of change, because you create something and it changes from not being there to existing. So it has an initial state and a final state. So it is a verb of change. But this change can have different meaning, different semantics. So basically, it can be a scalar and non-scalar change and some verbs given as examples. So some of the verbs require have an ordered set of values that they can take for a particular attribute, with the order from the initial towards the final state, while other verbs, they represent a more complex change, which cannot be expressed in terms of a scale of a single attribute. So they can have, for example, habitual activities. So it can be like a verb that presents a single action, but then if it's habitual, if it repeats itself on regular intervals or throughout a period of time, then it's not one. I mean, the basic meaning of the basic meaning of the verb is finished, so it's telic, but the repeating itself is can be infinite. So other authors, they argue that telicity of the dynamic predicates arises from a homomorphism between the event and some bounded participant in the situation. And this is a very helpful notion in order to determine which parts of the sentence basically we need to consider in order to be able to identify whether the verb is an activity. So basically, I think I didn't mention what an activity is actually in the aspectual classes because the audience is a bit mixed. Not all of you are linguists, but so in Wendler's classification, the activities are these non-bounded predicates that represent it is dynamic, but it's not bounded. So if we just go back to these features, so the classification of Wendler relies on 4 features: static, dynamic, telic, and punctual. So the states, starting from the states, they are static and not dynamic. They are not telic. Telic means that they have internally, in the meaning itself, contains an endpoint that is reached. So states are non-telic, and they are not punctual because they have a duration. So basically, with respect to these features, activities are non-static. They are dynamic. They represent some action. And also they are not telic, so they don't, in the meaning of the verb or in the appearance, in the realization of the verb in the sentence, it doesn't apply reaching an end state. So this is what actually makes activities different from accomplishments and achievements, which basically internally, in the meaning of the sentence, it is implied that there is an endpoint, there is a result that has been reached. And the difference between accomplishment and achievements is that one is punctual, so it becomes immediately true, and the other is durational. But basically, activities are dynamic, but on the other hand, they are non-telic, so they don't reach. They might reach an end state, but they don't imply it in the realization of the verb itself. And they are durational, they are not punctual. So going back to the semantic features. So to be able to distinguish a verb, whether it's an activity or its accomplishment or achievement, some authors use this bounded participant in the situation, which basically says, okay, this bounded participant, when the end of it is reached, then this is an end state, which means that it is implied in the structure of the sentence. So these verbs are telic. And we are looking for those that don't have this end state within the semantic structure. Some authors also distinguish between 2-point scales when, like, for example, with verbs like die or reach or shut, it's the door is either not shut and then it becomes shut. So just 2 points, it can't be halfway, although in some context it might. But other verbs have a multi-point scale. Like, for example, warm, you can warm something gradually, and it can get warmer and warmer and warmer. And also a distinction is made between closed scales and open scales. Closed scales when there is necessarily an endpoint, like with flatten. When something becomes flat, it's the end state. While, for example, with verbs like lengthen, you can lengthen it potentially infinitely. So basically, the scale is one feature, one semantic feature, which is frequently mentioned in works, and it needs special attention when considering how we can recognize, based on the sentence, based on the context, how we can recognize a verb to be an activity. and in particular verbs of creation. Also, something that needs mentioning that in Slavic languages, the verb aspect is a lexical category. So we distinguish between perfective verbs, which have always a telic interpretation, and imperfective verbs. Some of them might have either a telic implying an endpoint or atelic interpretation based on the context of the sentence. And some examples. Here, the tricky bit is that in Bulgarian, we can have like two different verbs, while in English, the translation is with the same verb. So, for example, той готви часове наред, he cooks for hours, which is an atelic interpretation of the verb to cook. And some other examples that show either a telic or a non-telic realization of the verb. For example, with the verbs gotvi, gotvia in Bulgarian, which is the perfective, it's always the telic interpretation. It always implies that something's finished, something's done. So the product of creation, the created entity, is always there at the end. So just a few words about the resources that I've used for this work. So WordNet, I won't be explaining a lot about WordNet, but the analysis is based on the class of creation verbs in WordNet, where there are 15 semantic classes of verbs, and they are like verbs of emotion, social verbs, verbs of communication, verbs of physical contact, and so on. And one of the classes is the verbs of creation. Verbs in WordNet are organized in shallow trees. So once on the top of the tree we have a verb of creation, we know that all of its hypernames down the tree are also potentially verbs of creation to a certain degree. So in this way, although down the tree we might have more specific meaning of the verbs, and some of them might be classified as other types of other semantic classes of verbs, but we know that they have in their meaning some notion of creation. So these are the verbs that I extracted from WordNet and analyzed them. And also just to mention that for English, I use the verbs from the Princeton WordNet and the related synsets from the Bulgarian WordNet. And here I listed just basically the types of the subclasses of verbs of creation within WordNet with their relevant synsets. Verbs of intentional creation of a physical object, verbs of creating a depiction, verbs of building, verbs of cooking, and so on. And this is not an exhaustive list, but these are the subclasses which have been represented in WordNet and which are relevant for the analysis. But there are more specific subclasses as well, which might be worth analyzing as well. So the other resource is FrameNet. Frames in FrameNet are schematic descriptions of the conceptual structure of situations. And each frame within WordNet, they are organized through a lot of hierarchical and other relations. But basically, each frame basically describes the situation with respect to the actors that take part, the circumstances that are around the situation, and other frame elements. What is used here is the mapping of frames of semantic frames from FrameNet onto WordNet synsets. So these verbs that are extracted from WordNet, they have attached to them a frame from FrameNet, which describes the general situation that this verb would appear in the particular sense from WordNet it's been connected to. Just an example from FrameNet. So this is the frame building with the definition of the frame. And here you can see with different colors marked the frame elements, agent, components, and created entity with an example. And also there are definitions of each of the frame elements, a definition and examples which illustrate the use of this frame element. These are only the core frame elements, but in my analysis, I included other frame elements as well, which might be relevant to the interpretation of the verb as an activity or not an activity. And also what is useful from FrameNet for each lexical unit. So you can see that here for the frame building, there is a list of lexical units. Not all of them are verbs. There are some nouns and adjectives and so on. But what is useful also for each lexical unit, in FrameNet, there is a list of syntactic patterns. First of all, there is a list of configurations of frame elements that this verb can appear with. So basically, I've just, for the verb built, one of the most common configurations is agent, components, and created entity. And you can see also the possible syntactic patterns that can appear in this configuration. And also what is also useful is their frequency in the corpus of annotated examples in FrameNet. This might be useful, for example, to exclude very rare cases, very rare examples, so that which are not representative for the usage of the verb. Here I show frames from FrameNet matched to the subclasses from WordNet of verbs of creation that I extracted. So basically what I tried here is to structure FrameNet subset of FrameNet dealing with verbs of creation to match to represent the verbs of creation that are found in WordNet. And especially focusing on the semantic features of the created entity, whether it's a physical object or an abstract object, and so on. And these are the two main corpora that I use to extract examples from. For English, that's the SemCore corpus. I chose these two corpora because they are annotated with WordNet senses. The English corpus is annotated, only the content words are annotated, while for the Bulgarian corpus also close class words like prepositions and conjunctions are also annotated with WordNet senses. But basically, what was important was to get the verb senses here, like to extract sentences with contained verbs which were potentially realized as activities, and to see all the examples that I could extract with verbs of creation, just to see how they are basically divide into activities and non-activities, and what are the contexts that basically determine whether it's an activity or not. So here's some annotated examples. He built a house. And also he built a garden bridge from recycled pallets, which we can see he built a house. It doesn't contain the what was the components? The components frame element, while the next example also contains the components frame element and realizes the patterns that we saw in a minute. Agent, created entity, and components. So some semantic features that were were generalized from the analysis. Creation verbs contain an agent, which can be realized as a creator, author, cook, in some frames, producer, or factory, and so on. The created entity can also have different semantic types. They are also what is specific for creation verbs is they always have a created entity, and in that sense they imply some sort of telicity. So what was interesting to see the cases where it's not exactly the case. And what I could extract is that in certain circumstances of realization of the created entity, or in certain appearance of certain frame elements, like for example time or place or explanation, purpose, in some cases these verbs can appear to be activities rather than imply reaching the end point. And these are some examples. Vaptsarov writes to so that he fulfills his creative drive. So, for example, in this case, although the created entity is implied to be some sort of texts or poems and so on, it is not expressed. In this case, his writing does not imply finishing certain created entities, but basically the activity itself. And also it can be like abstract nouns, such as Vaptsarov writes poetry, and also some nouns in plural, which also can be perceived as some sort of generalization of his works and not a particular created object. And also here, I just wanted to show some when there is like an expression presenting time or explanation of why he writes and so on, where there is not in the sentence doesn't imply the finishing a certain object, but rather the activity describes the activity itself. So the conclusions. The class of verbs of creation covers a wide range of semantically diverse phenomena, so they need more detailed analysis. And heading towards the automatic identification, we definitely need more data, because the automatic sort of process won't work with 200 examples. And thanks to the project that we're working on, and the Bulgarian National Science Fund for funding it.